So appreciate those of you that moved up because I will have some questions as we go, and I want you to be able to respond, and we'll just kind of have a little bit of a dialogue, which will make for great recordings, I'm sure, but that's okay. You're here, and we want to interact with you. Okay, so first question, why do we do scientific writing? Shout it out. What's the purpose? Get pay raise. Yeah, that's why we do it. Communication. What else? What do you think?
To give back to society.
Yeah, to give back, to share, right? A lot of it about communication, sharing your research. There's lots of reasons to do it. Educate, analyze, advance the knowledge base. Sometimes critique. We may write critiques of other work, review papers. How about persuade? Is that a fair one to say for scientific writing? Yeah, I agree. I think so. And especially when you're writing to seek support, when you're writing for funding, you need to persuade, right? So there's that element as well. Now, I teach a writing class, and this is one of the things I put up at the beginning of the writing class. It's for undergraduates. It's advanced composition. So I'm curious, take a look, and I'm going to see how many of you identify with each of these. How many A's? How many writing makes me happy? I love it. That tracks with my class. How about B? Now, kind of sad and, yeah, not so happy. Okay. C, frustrated. Yeah, I get that. D, writing is death. Oh, I'm sorry. You've chosen an interesting path. But, yeah, well, hopefully we'll get you through that. And then usually there's a fair number of E's where it's just, meh, I have to do it. I'll do it. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of us identify with that. Now, the question is why, especially if you find it frustrating, if you find it something that gets you down that you have to do, the question is why? Any thoughts about that? What is it that makes you feel that way? I have a couple of guesses, but I want to see if anybody's on the same page. What do you think? Say again? Yeah, the process can be slow. You know you're in for something that's not going to happen in the next 2 hours, right? Anybody feel like maybe sometimes, and this is hard to admit, but sometimes it's a little bit of a confidence issue? Yeah, I'm not sure I'm confident that, and that can kind of tie into imposter syndrome. How many of you are familiar with that? Yeah, I'm going to write, and everybody's going to find out I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Which is, I wouldn't say never the case, but I would say almost never. Very, very rarely. You're here for a reason. You're in your discipline for a reason. So having some confidence is a good thing when it comes to writing. All right, now this is another important one. I do this with undergrads as well. What's your outlook about your writing abilities? So some of you may feel I'm not a good writer. That's not going to change. I just have to get by. Or do you feel like there are aspects of your writing that can be improved and you believe that can happen? Anybody willing to admit they're on the A side maybe? I'm glad. Everybody on the B side? Okay, because that's your reality, right? That's called a growth mindset. A, that's a fixed mindset. You think your talents are your talents, it's not going to change, which all of your life experience should tell you is wrong. That we learn, we get better at things. Doesn't mean if you decide to start playing hockey today, you're going to be in the NHL, right? It's not going to happen. But you can still get better at it. So I'd love to see everybody on that B side. That's a good thing. Doesn't mean you ever turn into somebody who loves it. That's a different thing. But you can master it. You can get better at it. And I like this quote because it really ties into what we're talking about. Talent is a process, not a thing. Failure is not proof of an innate limit, but rather it's an indication of a skill you haven't yet developed. So if there's any part of writing that you feel like you haven't mastered yet, you have time, and probably for all of us in our careers that do writing, I feel like I will never stop trying to become a better writer and hopefully becoming better at different aspects of writing. All right, so I think when you're doing scientific writing, you're pulling from different pools of knowledge. You got the mechanics part, the vocabulary, the grammar, the structure, the flow, the tone. You have your research, right? What you've done, the how, when, where, what, why, all the things. And then you have the literature. What else has been done? That's kind of falling on your familiarity with the discipline and related literature. Okay, from my experience, part of this is based on undergrads and part of it based on grad students. But I would say in general, people's skills in the mechanics is eroding rapidly. The mechanical part of writing that I see in the classroom is sometimes atrocious. I should say, though, sometimes amazing. there are still some unbelievably gifted writers, which is great. Your familiarity with your research is usually strong, right? That may be for a lot of us the strongest part. We did it, we know what we did. We have to figure out how to explain it, but we have that part. And then the literature is just highly variable. For me, that was my most difficult part. Just engaging with the literature, finding time, taking time to do that, that was my most difficult part. So what about you? Just think about that. Or is there one, rarely are we equally strong in all three of these. So if there's one area that you feel like holds you back, maybe that gives you some guidance about something to work on, something you can try to improve. So what's your favorite section to write? Anybody say the abstract? Anybody feel like the abstract? Not usually, right? How about the intro? Usually, if anybody says intro, it means they're probably a creative writer. They like creative writing. They like storytelling. Materials and methods? Yeah. So have I mentioned that one of the parts you're probably familiar with or comfortable with is your research, right? That's how that shows up. How about results? Results for me is probably second. Discussion? That, depending on the work, for me, it totally depended on the work. What is the nature of the work? That is, I'm super comfortable, not as much. Yeah. Works cited, blah. I'm not even going to ask. And then tables and graphs. Anybody like putting together the tables and graphs? Yeah. For me, that's number one. Love that part. Okay. And if there's a part that you don't like to do, it's another good self-reflective question to ask why. Because then you start to drill down into the root causes for that discomfort, and then that gives you a chance to address those things. All right. Least favorite, would it just be the opposite? Shout out, I'm curious, how many would say least favorite would be discussion? Yeah, I could be there too. Yeah. What's another common least favorite? Abstract. For me, I didn't mind doing the abstract once everything else is done. Then I found it wasn't too bad. But yeah, that's another common one. Okay. The introduction, yes. In the papers I have my students write in the advanced composition course, the intro, they struggle with it. And they struggle with not using phrases like since the beginning of time or throughout human history. No, I'm not sure where you find those citations, but yeah, the intro can be pretty tough. I forgot to mention the intro. Now, another question for you is scientific writing also storytelling? Yes. Sometimes it's hard to make that connection because there's a word you may think of when you hear story, and that word is fiction, right? But not all stories are fiction. There's lots of nonfiction stories. So in my estimate, scientific writing is also storytelling, but there are parameters, there are norms that we try to follow. Okay, so I think yes, but even though it's scientific, it's still a story. We're looking for a logical flow all the way through the paper, all the different parts. Okay? But what we're trying to do is tell a story that bridges the gap between the data and how we understand the data. And if you can master this art, you can communicate your findings very effectively and even inspire action in others, which a lot of times is what we're trying to do, even if we don't consciously think of that. Now, hopefully we're striving for, in our disciplines, data-based objective storytelling. Okay, data-based storytelling is the art of crafting that narrative using data, and it involves leveraging data, that's the facts, the evidence, contextualizing that data, give it some importance, clarify what is meant by that, and then present the data to an audience in a meaningful way, and there we're trying to inform effectively. We can look at this a little bit different and connect it back to those three circles. When we're leveraging data, we're really drawing on our own research and the literature, right? We're interpreting our own data, we're connecting it to what else has been done. Contextualizing, I think also knowing your research and the literature, both important for that as well. And then presenting the data, again, depends on knowing your research to present it clearly, but that's really where mechanics come in. All the grammar and the stuff I mentioned earlier. Now, a little bit more in contextualization, where we're trying to add information to better understand what we're writing about. We're trying to give it some meaning and relevance. It's really essential for making the data more accessible. Data without context is really hard to interpret. It's hard to understand. It's hard to know as a reader, where do you go with that? So providing some context is really important. That's why we have introductions. That's why we have discussion sections. Okay? And it helps turn that complex data into meaningful and actionable insights. And it's also going to help us with identifying patterns and trends and avoiding misinterpretation, which we would like to do. Okay, now another question. Can you be creative? How many of you feel like when I'm writing a manuscript, I'm allowed to be really creative? Right. I don't see any hands. One hand, yeah. We kind of feel like that. But I would argue that you can be creative, again, within those norms and guidelines, right? There's a variety of ways to frame your story, primarily in the introduction and discussion sections, but you have different techniques, and I'm guessing you use these techniques without even thinking about them, which is fine, right? But there's lots of different storytelling techniques. Now, my goal here is not to go through all of these, but I have a QR code at the end of the slides, so if you want a copy of the slides, you can do that. But just a couple of examples. You have an and, but, therefore technique. So you start with known facts. How many of you would do that in a paper? You might start with some known facts. Yep. Okay. You introduce a problem or a tension, but we know this, but this is what we're working on. And then you're presenting a solution or a conclusion. That's the therefore part. You have nonlinear narratives. You know in movies how they'll use that flashback technique? Okay? We actually do that in writing sometimes, but you're probably not thinking about it in that way. But you may start with, here's the situation now. Throughout human history. No, don't do that. Here's the situation now, and then, well, how did we get there? Okay, that's another pretty common technique. You're not thinking of it in terms of nonlinear narrative, but that's what it is. And then you see lots of other choices. There's a couple others on this slide, some others on this slide, but you have different storytelling techniques. And I would not suggest that you need to become super familiar with all of these, but just realize there are different ways to tell that story, even in a short introduction, even in a discussion section. Okay, now I'm going to share a few thoughts about sections of the manuscript, and I'm going to present them in the order I recommend, which really means the order that works for me. You may have a different order that works for you. I have some stronger thoughts about a few of the sections, but I'm going to be pretty brief on these because you have other people to hear from as well, and they're going to share their thoughts. So tables and graphs, I think it's a great place to start. Spend some time here. You might hear this again. When you're preparing tables and graphs for a particular journal, if you could follow the guidelines, that'd be great. That would be great. Including the number of columns and rows and how it's supposed to be formatted, all of those things. As a reviewer, it's irritating when the guidelines aren't followed, and it's the same thing I tell my class. When my class doesn't follow my directions and put headings in, I want them to put headings in their papers. When I don't see the headings, I get irritated. Why do you want me to be irritated when I'm going to grade your paper or when I'm going to review your paper? So follow those guidelines. Make sure the presentation of the data, how you're describing your treatments, how you're labeling them, make sure all of that matches what you're presenting in the materials and methods. I see that from time to time, and it's very confusing. If how you describe it in the text is not the way you present it in the tables or the figures, it's very confusing. And then order things logically so that you fit your desired approach in the results and discussion sections. We should catch it as reviewers, but we don't want to see table 1 and then you talk about table 4 and then table 2 and present it in a logical order. Okay, the results, I would compare the results section to a movie. You're seeing the whole thing, right? You're getting the whole story. Okay? But like a movie, when they film a movie, not everything they film makes it into the movie. There's stuff that gets cut. Now, I want to urge caution here, but at times, there are things we may do as part of an experiment that are maybe extraneous. Maybe we tried something, it didn't work. It's not necessary for the interpretation of the data. There may be times where not every single thing that you did has to be included, but those are discussions to have with your advisors. Those are things to think carefully about. Because sometimes something we think might not be important actually is to a reader who can assign some importance to that. Okay. And again, with negative results. Be careful thinking you just should omit those because those are important as well. All right, materials and methods I compare to a recipe. Okay, somebody else should be able to follow that recipe, but I think a specific kind of recipe. I would say baking. Right? Anybody a baker out there? Okay, when you're baking, how important are those measurements? Very important, right? So you think of it in terms of you are going to post this recipe online, and it's a baking recipe, and it's going to be read by somebody who has no experience cooking at all. They're going to need really, really good directions. They're going to need to know exactly how to put that together. Okay? And that's what we want to see. We want to really understand the approach and how it was done. Now, fortunately, when you're doing recipes, you don't also have to say, baked for 350 degrees for an hour in a GE oven that was purchased at Dick Van Dyke Hardware. You don't have to provide all of that in a recipe, but sometimes you do, right? We need some information about equipment. Okay. So clarity here to me is just very, very important. Be as clear as you possibly can. And remember, part of clarity is good mechanics. The grammar, sentence structure, the flow, all of that. Okay. And then from your materials and methods, could you draw the experimental design or represent it clearly graphically? I say that because that's something I would do. I actually would draw out what we did, and that helped me turn it into text. That technique may or may not work for you, but I like that technique for me. Discussion, again, personally, this is among the most difficult sections for me, but I compare this kind of to a movie critique. Okay, we've seen what we've done. Now let's go in and discuss it. How does it compare to other things that have been done? Where might we go from here? You understand what discussions are about. But consider your readers and the level of expertise, and this can be impacted by the specific journal that you're writing for. So know a little bit about that journal. What is the readership? Understand who is likely reading your work in that journal. And if you're doing comparative work, you're comparing across species. One thing I find difficult when I'm reviewing is I know that you are referencing papers that might be from swine and poultry and other animals. And in the discussion, I sure like to see just a quick mention of that. In this previous research with poultry, with swine, because that means a lot more to me than if you omit that and I have to go to the references and try to figure that out. The intro, I look at the intro like a funnel. Maybe you start broad. You're starting kind of broadly with what the issues are, and you're going to funnel the reader down to the specifics of what you are writing about. And it gets very narrow at times because you might now focus on very important previous research and then get very specific with what you've done. Okay? But here I do believe you have some flexibility with your storytelling techniques. Just make sure you conform to those norms and guidelines. And then in the abstract, this to me is like a movie trailer, except the movie trailer doesn't want spoilers, and we're okay with spoilers in the abstract. We want to see the main things there. And there are people who are tempted to start with the abstract, to make that the starting point for your manuscript. I think a problem with that, and this is one of the things I do feel strongly about, is that if you start with that general nature of the abstract might carry over as you write the manuscript. And that's really not what you want to have happen. So now you've had abstracts here at the meeting, I'm sure many of you, most of you, and it may be tempting to go back and use that as a starting point for your manuscripts that you'll be writing, but I would set it aside and then you can come back to that and make changes, etc. But don't let that drive necessarily the direction of the manuscript. Okay, I'm going to reverse the order of a few slides here because I've got my priorities and I want for sure to go over these two. Addressing the obvious. So this is one of those participation things. I'm going to give you a second. You can talk to a neighbor, talk to somebody behind you. If this were a methionine experiment, I'm a nutritionist, so this was the easiest thing to come up with. What should you address in the text? So here we have just a basal diet, and we're adding methionine to that diet, and we have calculated composition and analyzed composition, and you can see methionine levels in red. So if you're reviewing this, what would you like to have seen the author address? Okay, so take a second, and you can chat about this. That's a level of discussion I get in class sometimes. Okay, I'm not giving you a lot of time, but any thoughts? Any thought? And I'll tell you what would draw my attention to this as a reviewer is if I saw in the results that the analyzed composition was in good agreement with the calculated. Because when I see that, I'm going right to the table. Is that accurate? Is that accurate for this experiment, do you think? I would say not really. Okay. The problem here, the basal diet looks spot on, but what's being added is progressively larger. Now, is that a fatal flaw to this experiment? We don't have enough information here to know that. It could be, but it may not be, right? But I would want to see this addressed, to think in your head, oh, if I don't mention it, maybe they won't notice. Might not be the best approach. Now, let's look at this one. And the main thing here is just take a quick look and see if you think the interpretation would be the same or different. Anyone willing to volunteer? Does anyone see what is especially different in this one? What do you think? You lose 0 points for being wrong. It's okay. What am I looking at? Yeah. Yeah, there's consistency there, starting with which treatment? Yeah, starting with diet 1, right? It looks to me like diet 1 probably had a little bit more methionine than calculated, and that carried over into the other treatments. This would be a different interpretation, in my opinion, okay? So think about things like that. You'll find things that, hey, we know this may draw into question this aspect or that aspect, but I think it's better to address it than not, okay? Because reviewers will likely notice, and if reviewers notice, the broader readership will notice as well. Now let's go back to some of these other things, and these are examples I use in my class. So I've gone to the country of Malawi in Africa a couple of times. I use that country as an example quite often. And here I just want to show you how stories can be framed and some of the care we need to take when we're doing that. Okay? So first one, this is product production for several different segments. We have beef and poultry, pork, dairy, and eggs. So we have the amount of production in the country, and we have the amount of consumption, which is just per capita consumption times the population. Not super accurate, but take a look at those two columns. And the question for this one is, how well balanced are production and consumption? Okay. Now, how many would say they're actually pretty well balanced? The amount produced is pretty similar to the amount consumed. Now you're scientists, so you're looking at this down to like the single digit, right? But you have to look pretty broadly, take the broad view of that. I think they're pretty similar. I think production and consumption are pretty similar. So if this is all we have, we might say that story looks pretty good. In Malawi, production is balanced with consumption. It's good. But how does this change our interpretation? So this is per capita consumption of these products in Malawi compared to the world per capita consumption average. Okay, kilograms per person per year. How similar are these? Much lower, with one exception, pork consumption, okay? But for the rest, and which two in particular are strikingly low? Dairy and eggs, okay? Dairy and eggs. So does this change your opinion of what the situation may be in Malawi? Maybe it's not as rosy, it's nice and balanced, everything's great, okay? Now, do we know if people want to eat more of those? Not necessarily. In fact, I do know that it's a culture that doesn't consume much dairy. That's part of the issue with dairy, but they also don't have enough product to consume. Okay? So it's another piece of the picture. And what I'm trying to illustrate with these examples too is ask yourself the question that people will ask themselves when they're looking at your work. Anticipate those questions. I think it's an interesting question. Does consumption determine production, or does production determine consumption? Okay. A little bit of both. In a country like Malawi, it's more production's determining consumption. Actually, their finances are. Okay? Now, does this change or enhance the story? Now we have some information about daily protein supply, how much of that protein comes from plants, how much from animals, and then we have information about hunger and undernourishment, malnutrition, share of children who are underweight. It's another piece of the story. What else might this tell us? What part of the story might this tell us, do you think? Do you think, is consumption perhaps impacting health in the country? Yep. Most of their protein comes from corn. Is that going to be enough for a child? No, right? Energy, yes. Protein, not even close. Okay, so a lot of plant protein. So the story is building to where, okay, production matches consumption, but consumption's lower than world averages. A lot of the protein comes from plants and not animals. That appears to have some impact on their health. And then one of the things I enjoy showing the students is this table, because now we can really dig into what leads to production yield per animal. And there's lots of ways we could go. So this is production yield per animal for the different products and for eggs. And it's just another part of the story. Why is production low? Why is animal protein consumption low? And some of it is yield per animal is low. Okay? You see, especially, there's none that jump out to me more than milk, right? So you'd say, well, Malawi needs to bring in genetics that have a higher milk production, right? Get better cattle for milk production. But what's the problem with that? What might be missing from that? What's that? Food, for sure. Yeah, feed. Yep. What kind of animals give us milk? Cows. What else? Goats? Buffalo? Sheep? Okay. So this, the data that I pulled this from does not distinguish. So if you're comparing a country that produces milk from lots of cattle to a country that uses goats, there's going to be a big yield difference, and that's part of what's behind this. So I just bring that up again to say there are pieces to the story that you may not be thinking about as you're putting the data together, but try. Use a critical eye, take a look at your data, and try to anticipate the questions that people are going to ask, the things they're going to wonder about. Can you answer all of those questions? Hopefully not, because if you can, then as soon as you publish that, you can find something else to do with your life, right? So it's okay when there's more questions, that's fine. But sometimes it's interesting to the reader to just see some discussion about that. We don't know this or this, but here's a direction that we could go to learn more. Okay. All right. So when you're presenting and interpreting data, when you're telling the story, you do have a responsibility to be accurate and objective. Anyone have a guess if that is becoming more challenging with undergraduates or less challenging? To get them to be objective and accurate. How many say more challenging? You are right. It is becoming more challenging, right? There's so many sources they can access that are not objective. And for me, one of the tasks I spend a lot of time on is how to help them distinguish how do you present a fact and how do you present an opinion. And it's very important that you're clear about that. Okay? So those are the cautions. Some of the things that it might be tempting to do at times is, thinking what we want the story to be, what we expect the story to be, and selecting data to fit a predetermined narrative or point of view. We want to avoid that. You know that already, but I think it's good to state that. Misinterpretation of data, intentional or unintentional, we want to try to avoid that. Unintentional misinterpretations happen. That's part of the scientific process, I think. We don't always understand things as well now as we will tomorrow. Okay? But just another caution, and certainly falsifying information, which I'm not going to spend any time on because we all know that's an issue. Going over time is another thing that you don't want to do. Which I don't think I am, actually, because we already did this. Do you remember seeing this before? Very good. That's what I like to hear when I'm teaching. You've seen this before. Yeah. Okay, a few tips. Objectivity and accuracy. Approach writing in an order that works for you. I put the word up there recently because I'm not sure everybody understands what that means. The cost of feed and animal production has recently become an issue. Well, if recent to you is, the last 100 years or so, okay? But think about that word when you're using recently. Avoid overly broad statements that are easily debunked or appear biased. That's, again, a challenge in my class. Check the accuracy of your statistics, because your reviewers are likely going to do that, and anticipate those questions. Lastly, boy, if you get a chance to proofread, that'd be great. That definitely helps. Have somebody else read it as well, because does anybody else here struggle with not being able to proofread your own work as well as you can other people's? That's a very normal, natural thing. Okay. Know yourself. When do you do your best writing? And this for me is very important. I write well in the morning, the early morning. If I write at night, it is incoherent garbage that I have to just delete the next day. I know that about myself, and so I try to structure my time as much as I can to be able to do the activities that I'm good at that time of day during that time of day. The environment you're surrounded by. I work best in noise. I always have music going or something. It's very distracting to me to be in a totally silent environment. Many people are the opposite, but you have to know yourself. So what type of environment do you need? Even the smells can be important, right? If somebody's baking bread at home while you're trying to write, that doesn't work for me. And then how susceptible are you to distractions or the allure of other tasks? I need to go do this. I need to go do that. Separate yourself from that. These are the miscellaneous things, right? Final thoughts. I think it's good as you think about your writing, and I still ask myself this, what is your biggest obstacle or challenge, and what can you do to address it? If you have that growth mindset, you can do things to address it. You can improve in your writing skills. Even if you are excellent now, you can be even better. Okay? And again, it comes down to believing no matter what your skill level right now, your writing skills can improve. All right, well, I will stop there. Appreciate the opportunity, Joanne. This was a lot of fun to put together, and thank you for attending.